In the winter of 1614, a royal census record from the west coast of Scotland arrived in Edinburgh. There were no tears, no missing pages, and the final figures matched perfectly. Except for one oddity, page 17 had been completely wiped clean of ink by some unknown chemical, but the parchment still held traces of what had been written initial letters, without surnames, dates, without years, and a final column of slash-like slashes recording rations so small they could not sustain life. No addresses, no occupations, no family groups, just numbers written and erased. Months later, a folio pin bearing the royal seal of James VI was discovered not in a vault, but wedged between two human thigh bones in a sealed limestone chamber excavated by chance during roadworks near Bennane Head. Inside, more than 100 baby bones, not by size, but by symmetry. There were no leather bags, no accompanying papers, and no official statements. And then, like a mist spreading without shape or form in 6 different offices, from the census office to the parish, there appeared an unsigned note, handwritten in the margins. This is not a clan. No explanation, no source, no comment, no debate, just written, like the video. And subscribe to the 7th sign if you want to continue the stories pulled from the records that no one wants to open again. And if you're listening now, tell me what country you're in and what time it is. There's something comforting in knowing that though we're separated by borders and years, we're still reading the same erased page. This is the story behind the redacted census entries, buried beneath the sea rocks, sealed with the royal seal. This is the mystery of the Makra clan resurrected from the forgotten records of the Bean family. They sent one man, William Dre, across the heather-covered hillsides, quill and string compass in hand. He was not a man of much emotion or inventiveness. His fingers were stained with lamp ink and parchment oil, and his shoes were always too tight, making his gait slow and limping. The task he had received from the Privy Council was simple: to take a census of the villages along the west coast, especially the craft communities and those that might be taxed to the crown. Dre had already surveyed the Cumnock and Daly valleys and was now walking slowly towards Ballantrae, with the sea on his left and the cold wind in his ears. But there was one thing Dre had not prepared for, and there was no mention of it in his notebook absences. According to the Jovan Church Register, the area between Turnberry and Bennane Head should have had 173 taxables, a small but steady number. Dre arrived in early May, armed with a leather notebook, 2 assistants, and the meticulous patience that had earned him praise for redemarcating the border in 1603. He went from house to house, marking hearths, livestock, and able-bodied adults. No questions, no comments, just nodded and wrote. It was not until he reached the last house, a stone hut tucked away in the shadow of a barren hillside, that he realized the discrepancy. He had recorded only 156 people in all, 17 souls missing. Not a rumor, not the wind or a mistake. Their names were in the church register in ink, signed by the pastor himself. They had paid their property taxes last year, but now no one came forward when called. No smoke from the kitchen, no footprints, no old shoes by the door, not a single bone in the ashes. Dre went back to Gavan to check, and the deacon just glanced at the register. scratched the paper with a dull fingernail and waved his hand. Maybe they're just miscounting, or they're nomads. They must have moved up the red copper slopes. Do you think so? Do you think 17 people could just evaporate like the wind, leaving no trace behind? Or is there something deeper, a lie legitimized by silence? The land was barren, but Dre had climbed all the slopes, and still no one. Still, he wasn't the type to argue with the clergy. He simply closed his survey book, stood up, and continued toward the western cliffs. That night, camped under a leaning oak, Dre took a pen and sketched a topographical map, the contours of the coastal slope, the mossy paths that led up to the high cliffs of Bennane. In the dying candlelight, and with a hand that trembled from the strain of a surveyor's muscles, Dre unconsciously noted something invisible to the naked eye. Near the shadowy edge of the cliff, between the delicately cross-hatched rocks, two thin wisps of smoke appeared, almost by accident. A reflex, as if his hand had become accustomed to recognizing signs of life. Two thin wisps of smoke rose from a depression in the rock, right where the land curved toward the sea. But Dre saw no huts, no smoke or split wood, no sign of a fire. He didn't erase them, he just circled them. A small, hesitant circle, and in the margin, in barely legible handwriting, wrote, "Smoke, but no roof." In his official report to Edinburgh, Dre still listed the full population, with a note about the 17 missing. He offered no theories, just local ambiguity, perhaps tax evasion or winter famine, migration. The sketch was attached, but the smoke circle detail was omitted from the summary. The clerk of the council dismissed it as a blemish, and yet the original map was still kept in the survey room at the archives, and beneath the circle, in the handwriting of a later cartographer, a note appears. No land grants were ever made for this hollow. No settlements are recorded here before 1682. The ink beneath the circle appears to have been burned away. Dre died in 1620 of an unknown illness. His final journal, never entered into the official records, was only discovered years later among papers auctioned off from his estate. Inside, between lines of coordinates and measurements, is a final handwritten entry that smoke is not seasonal. The cliffs never count twice. No one knows who Dre was referring to. All that is known is that in 1614 the west coast of Scotland was short of people, and no one asked. The sea did not return them. Not all. And not all. In early June, still in the census year, a thick fog settled over the Firth of Clyde, and the sea was unusually warm. The three fishermen did not return to the lower landing at Ballantrae. They were not relatives, but familiar faces in the harbour. Lachlan Ma, who could tie knots no one else could untie. Elric Shaw, who never slept on shore. William Dow, who had no relatives but who always kept a copy of the Psalms sewn into his undershirt. They set out in separate boats the same week. Neither returned. But what unsettled the villagers was not the disappearance, but the orderliness of it. There was no storm, no big waves. The weather was calm that week. Their nets had been recently mended. Their boat had been seen leaving, confirmed by those on shore. And then, not a piece of wood had floated back. No masts, no planks, only absence. And then, absence again. The Ballantrae Safety Register kept by Deacon Hargrave in 1608 had recorded the incident. His handwriting was thin and neat. Each name had a line, a date, a title, assumed to have drowned. But in the weeks that followed, something strange happened. Hargrave crossed out the names more than once. At first, it was a simple routine stroke, like so many names had been crossed out. But one Sunday evening after his sermon, he returned to the register and made another hard stroke. This time, the stroke was deep wide, cutting through the paper so that the ink soaked through the page and the wooden table. When asked by the church administrator if he had made a mistake, Hargrave simply replied, "No, I wrote it right. I just crossed it out the wrong way." And it was the note in the margin that made the whole book so murky. Right next to William Dow's, sandwiched between the date and the cross someone had written, in a slightly lighter ink, "Salt doesn't hold everything." What are you thinking? If someone had disappeared, not in a storm but in the silence, not swept away, but as if they had never existed. If the crosses weren't the end, but the sign of something that was never meant to be said. Tell me where you're hearing it. Across time zones, across history, there are stories like this, sitting in the books waiting for you to open them. The line, not Hargrave's, and it did not appear anywhere else in the notebook. The ink had browned at the edges, and later when held up to an oil lamp, a librarian noted that it had been written in haste. The pen had been dragged across the water-soaked paper as if the notebook had been soaked with sea salt and then quietly put back on the shelf. No church meeting had mentioned the marginal note. No one asked, no one answered, but strange things began to follow. Elric Shaw's brother reported to the authorities a bundle of nets found near the rocks at Bennane. Head nets, tied in a knot Elric knew how to use, having learned from an old sailor from Port Patrick. There was no boat nearby, no anchor, no rope. Just the net folded, laid down carefully as if it had just been returned. 2 weeks later, the name Lachlan Ma appeared, carved into the side of a fish barrel in Govan, nearly 15 miles away. Not painted, but scratched faintly with a blunt knife. The barrel maker claimed it had been sealed for more than a year. Inside, only spoiled brine and a broken tooth. The town held no funerals. 3 names, no bed, no grave, no ceremony, lay like rotting debris on the edge of the parish register. The wives, if we can call them that, were said to have never ventured near the shore again. One of them, Marin, was found sleeping on the church steps, clutching her husband's seaman's coat, muttering, "He was never given to the sea." Hargrave, for his part, resigned before the year was out. He cited ill health, though there had been no record of it. In the last line, as the ink was running low, he rewrote the title of the logbook, "Book of Safe Returns," and underneath, 2 words repeated, "Absent." The page was unsigned, but on the back of the cover, faded with age, another line appeared, pressed so deeply into the leather that time could not erase it. One of them still counts. By breathing. The sea keeps secrets, but not all secrets. Drown. She had been crossing the sea for years, shoes worn down by the stones, hunchbacked by washtubs and ash pots. But in the last weeks of that wet and quiet summer, she no longer walked the coast. Her name was never fully recorded in any church book. It was mentioned only as Monsieur Bear, washerwoman at the Kirkuswald Inn, with a small dot beside her name, a sign of payment in labor rather than money. When she was allowed, it was said, she slept on canvas and straw. No social traces were left, only work, but some people remembered her, the chambermaids, the one-armed porter, and the bartender. They say she began to linger by the fire after dusk, glancing at the window as if afraid it would open without the wind. First, she asked for an extra hour, then for an extra bed, and finally, a lock for the barn door. She refused the coast path. It wasn't long, nor was it dangerous. Just a gentle stone path from behind the inn, leading to the hawthorn picking grounds. No graveyard, no sheer cliffs, just the land that sloped down to Ballantrae. But she wouldn't take it even in the moonlight. Not even with an escort, not even with money. When asked, she wouldn't explain. Just said, "I heard them." And then, I heard nothing more. The innkeeper, Mr. Fergus Drummond, ignored her pleas. He said she was old and delirious, having lived alone for too long. When she was refused a place to sleep for the third time, she returned home alone, wrapped in a shawl, holding each other tightly, her fingers still stained with soap powder. She was not seen again for 3 weeks. No one reported her missing, at least not immediately. The Kirkoswald washerwomen were constantly on the move, called in when ships came in or when a house needed help. But on the 22nd day, a child collecting firewood near the fork in the road along the shore found an object wrapped in wool placed under a thorn bush. It was a bundle of linen, still damp, hastily folded as if it were unfinished, although it was not raining. Inside, nestled like a bird's nest, was an empty spool of thread. The last thread had not been cut, but torn. She was found a few hours later, sitting just below the ledge between the worn stones of the path and the first hollow of the raccoon field. Her body sat upright, knees to her chest, eyes facing forward. No wounds, no blood, no broken bones. Only her hands were tightly wrapped around the empty spool. Her knuckles were white. Her thumbs were pressed so deep that the skin was torn. A doctor from Ayr was called in, a man who had made a name for himself in recovering sailors' bodies and had written extensively on the condition of bodies left in water for a long time. He noted the strange preservation of the posture, stiff but not decayed. And what was even more puzzling, her jaw. It was locked, not from screaming, not from breathing. It was the posture, he wrote, of someone listening with his whole mouth, someone waiting to answer. In her apron pocket, they found a small piece of paper, the kind used to label jars of flour or barrels of cloth. On it, just a faint pencil line. Not this way. No, this way. Again. What do you think she heard, or who? Have you ever stood alone in the middle of a deserted street and felt not that someone was following you, but that you were no longer a person, but a mark for someone to count? We're not done yet. Do you have a sequel? I'm still here, keeping the fire burning. Her handwriting was not hers. And yet, the spool of thread, according to the maids, had never left her hand since the first week she refused to leave the house. She said she spun it in her sleep to keep track of time, but no one had ever seen her actually use it. After her burial, a simple, unmarked grave on the eastern edge, the path she had walked on, was given a new name. People began whispering, "The Silent Way." Children stayed away after the third bell. Some said the cattle stopped in the middle of the path as if something was waiting. 2 years later, a small entry appeared in Kirkoswald's ledger. The expense margin read, "Ordered, new sheets. Washer missing again." No explanation, no name, no inquiry, just a line circled in charcoal foley. And this time, the spool was full. No one knew why. No reason was ever recorded. Only one question remained. Who returned the string, and why did she never use it? The instrument case was made of mortise and tenon wood, sealed with sea salt resin, and the brass inside was still bright enough to catch the seagull's sunlight. Engineer Andrew Carnes was a man of such meticulousness that even the coldest royal standards could not help but respect it. Every measuring chain was double-checked. Every orientation was recorded in his hand, a hand that never shook. Yet, on the 11th day of the coastal survey, the ground itself betrayed that certainty. It began with a silence, a polite theft of sound just after dawn when the surveyors reached the headland the locals called Giant's Elbow. The tide was low, revealing a string of black jade-like rocks at the base of the cliff. 5 Jovan workers hired by the week dragged the tripod to the edge. They joked that only a seal could hear their hammers. Then, the ground moved. Not an explosion, not a catastrophic crack, just a slight tremor through the soles of their shoes and the bones of their feet, as if something enormous was sighing beneath the grass. One man clung to the measuring lens. Another cursed as the plumb bob swayed as if someone had pulled on its string. Carnes ordered them to stop, lie prone, and put their ears to the ground. The shock lasted less than a heartbeat, but the hollowness that followed the silence lasted longer. When they counted their tools, the mahogany case containing the topographic instrument, the irreplaceable kind, was gone. The youngest insisted he had placed it directly on the coil of rope, just 3 paces from where Khan stood. But the ground showed no drag marks, no indentations. Only a thin, letter-stitched gash ran beneath the seagrass. Carnes knelt, tracing the crack with his knuckles. As his fingernails slid through and entered, the crack opened like a black mouth swallowing a clump of weeds. The group jumped back as the ground gave way, revealing a steep rock face that slid into velvety darkness. A strange smell rose up, not rotten, nor the smell of the sea, but something older, as if the air had been exiled from the light for too long. Carnes lowered a measuring chain. There was no bottom for 40 feet. He then tied a white chalk plumb bob to the end of the rough rope and let it down. When he pulled it up, the chalk was worn clean, as if scraped by a stone jaw. But only the end of the rope was wet. In his field notebook, folio 122, he drew the mouth of the hole in a cross-sectional diagram. An irregular opening about 4 feet, a man crouched down could pass through. The drawing showed the crack as a throat narrowing and widening beyond the reach of the oil lamp. He also noted a rhythmic echo was heard from below, like water splashing against hollow wood, though according to the tide tables, the sea must have been 100 yards away. The committee called for speed, not archaeology, but Carnes ordered a quick exploration. 2 men were roped and lowered to the edge of the crack. They had not gone more than a man's height when the rope was pulled taut and the lamp flickered green. Both reported a wind so cold it stitched the lungs, and the sound they heard, like rope being pulled through rough hands. Carnes immediately sealed the entrance. They pushed the unfinished boundary stones into the pit, piled sod over them, and drove in stakes in the shape of the royal coat of arms, a warning to road crews to avoid the east. They packed up camp before sunset. Carnes was determined not to leave even a urinal. That night, when he stopped at the parsonage in Ballantrae, he couldn't sleep. On the parson's desk was a notebook listing the names of missing fishermen. 3 names had been crossed out twice. The edges were soaked with brown ink mixed with salt, and on the shelf next to it was a map of the settlement by William Dray, with a smoky circle marking the exact spot where Carnes had crossed the cliff that morning. Are you feeling the same way I am? That there is something unnamed, unearthed, but watching? If you feel the same way, stay with Sleepy History Tales. I will continue the story. The drawn boundaries. The oval smoke from Dre's pipe and the circular marks from Kansas markers, all of them were cuts on an open wound. As dawn broke, Cans rode back alone to check the seal. The stones were gone. The grass was perfectly flat, save for a faint indentation, the shape of a clenched fist. Where the boundary markers had been, only fragments remained clean, straight unmarked by wind or rain. And right in the center, the planimeter case reappeared, standing upright as if someone had deliberately placed it there. The brass pin was still closed with no trace of prying, but inside, the glass indicator had crumbled into ash. Cans wrote a final entry in his diary, then sent his report back to Edinburgh. The gap resists all attempts at control. Recommend alternative inland route. No further excavation without ecclesiastical supervision. The Royal Roads Commission kept the report, but did not approve the cost of the route. Funds were tight. The coastal route was irreplaceable. Work was rescheduled for the following spring. Cans did not return. He requested a transfer, citing prolonged shaking of the hand in his file. An internal memo approved the application in silence. None of the builders have since recovered the pit he had drawn. However, new paving stones laid near the old survey line have been sinking irregularly faster than the mortar has time to harden, gradually tilting into a void that no instrument can measure. And every winter, as the ice lifts the land, the people of Gavin hear a soft clattering sound from beneath the cliffs. Wood against stone. Rhythmic, precise, as if someone, an invisible engineer, is still measuring the shoreline from below. Brother Wyman's ink had run thick that winter. The leather notebook he used, bound so tightly and sewn with coarse thread, had absorbed the sea's vapors, making its pages warp like rain-soaked wooden doors. Yet his December notes were still intact, crisp, fragile, but not lost. At first, they were just ordinary notes, an inventory of firewood, spoiled salted meat, a sermon to a pilgrim stonemason. Until the 12th day, a small line appeared, drawn close to the edge of the page in unusually thick ink. Children received 6. Gate unlatched. No names, no destination, no companions. The 6 children, 5 boys, 1 girl arrived just before Vespers at St. Fain's Abbey, on the edge of the Jervin forest. The gatekeeper said he found them sitting in a neat row on the stone bench outside the gate, against the iron hinges. No one knocked. They just waited. When asked their names, they were all silent. Their clothes were thin but clean. Brown woolen trousers, ash-stained cloaks, one with a fishing line tied around his waist. His shoes were not muddy. His hands were clean. His nails were cut short and square, not with scissors, but by habit. By custom, the monastery let strangers stay for 2 nights while they verified their identity through the parish. Most were lost children, poor peasants, or girls who had run away from the salt stations. But these 6 children, not like that. When the stew was served that evening, none of them touched it. The girl, slim with tightly braided hair, pushed her bowl aside and asked in a strange, slow voice, "Do you have any black sausage with blood in it?" Brother Thomas, the kitchen manager, said her voice was low, without nuance, without coldness, but rather learned. When he said no, the group refused everything else. No crying, no pleading. Just sit there quietly. That night, the monks decided to let the children rest in the old barn, away from the sick room where the fever was. They spread out mattresses, leaving a candle in the far corner. Brother Wyman recorded the incident in his side diary. A lost children, no confirmation. Calm. One speaks, the others imitate. The next morning, the 2 monks heard low chanting, coming from the barn before dawn. When they checked, they found that the bedding had been moved not in a straight line as before, but in a circle, the edges touching. No one admitted to doing it. When asked about her relatives, the girl replied, "We belong to what is waiting, but we are allowed to warm ourselves." Brother Alcuin thought it was just childish play. He tried to press her further, but she did not blink. He described her eyes as blindless, a phrase later questioned by the historian himself. The other 5 remained silent. The 3rd day was not a rule. Abbot had sent a letter to the parish of Girvan to find out about births or missing children. The reply came back quickly, no sender, no preamble. There was only a line written in a black pen in the middle of the page. "No one from here. No records. Please stop looking." The convent kept the children for another night. It was too dark to let them out. By this time, they were eating, but only sausages made fresh that day, no matter the wrapper. She always asked first, the other 5 followed suit. They chewed slowly as if weighing each bite. Brother Thomas noted that none of them drank water. Not once. The morning of the 5th day, they were gone. No doors were opened. No locks were broken. Are you awake? Do you think those children really came from somewhere else? Not on the map, not in the records, just sitting quietly and waiting. Tell me, what do you feel is lurking in the darkness of St. Fain's Abbey? The woolen blankets in the barn were neatly stacked, 6 neat stacks, not a single fold amiss. In the center of the room, imprinted in the cold ash, was a perfect circle the size of a wagon wheel. No footprints led in nor out. The windows remained locked from the inside. The Wymans made no conclusion. Only a brief entry in the parish register. Unrecorded children leave no trace. Do not search. The gates remain closed. But then, in the quiet years that followed, 6 new names quietly appeared on baptismal records across Assur. Not by priests, but in the margins of marriage certificates, cattle sales, even ship passenger lists. No parents, no birthplace, just signatures crooked, all in the same stroke, very long. Vertical strokes, very short, horizontal strokes, and a crescent-shaped hook at the bottom of each G. The ink in each signature was identical, almost pitch black. But when held to the light, it showed a dull red, like thin blood, pressed on parchment. Next to the last name was a strange handwriting taken from Jervin's own granary, allowed to warm. The wait continues. The abbey burned down in 1643. But the gate without a name, without a path, still stood. The final report bore no name, only a faint broken seal as if pressed by a trembling hand, or a seal too old to be of any authority. The parchment bore no address, only the year in Roman numerals MDCA, that is 1604, the ink smeared along the folds. The upper left corner, where the Privy Council seal would normally be, bears a strange symbol instead, a simple, childlike eye, 5 lashes unblinking. Historians later dubbed it the King's Fifth Eye. The title was unofficial, but it quietly survived in footnotes, faded cataloguing, and handwritten inventories in the margins of missing census records, something you might have heard of if you pored through post-feudal road records. One note, carefully folded in plain cloth and locked in a drawer in an Edinburgh office, was not discovered until 1631. It described a secret campaign along the west coast of Scotland, conducted not by soldiers but by standardizers under the direct authority of King James VI. No public purpose, no military signature, not included in any official register. The opening sentence was simple but chilling. In the Bennane Hills and the mouth of the Glen Valley, there are families who carry no Bibles, no family names, no periods. The writing in the report was dense and odd. The ink ran over the edges. The smears were caused by a dried, liver-colored adhesive that the catalogers described as smelling faintly like hot iron. They had to use gloves to handle it. But the content is truly chilling. The writer, whose identity has never been established, describes a group of people living in the bushes at the foot of the cliff. There are no tents, no huts, just structures made of stone and skin, probably animal skins, but some pieces are unclear. No smoke, no stoves, but the ground is blackened with smoke as if something were burning underneath. No old people. Many of the women are pregnant, but the men do not speak. Their eyes do not look outward but follow something along the report reads. When asked for the date, they tilt their heads as if the answer were behind them. The total number of people living in the area is unknown. The writer notes only that they move as if orchestrated, not gathering, not running, just shifting places like a body, adjusting itself in sleep. The phrase family wild disorder appears twice, once in reference to the strangely similar behavior, and once blurred so that only a repeat of the word can be guessed. The clearest remaining line reads, "A boy came forward when called and held out his hand." There was no line upon the palm. There are no further details, no maps. The writer finishes in haste. They are not tainted by sin, but by order. The legacy lies in the pattern, not in the blood. The final line fades as if drawn out while the ink was still dry. The report never made it into the official record. It was stuffed into drawer number 5, the council's forgotten filing cabinet, behind some debt judgments and unsanctioned marriages. The report remained forgotten until 1631, when a cataloger named Edmund Doug discovered it. He wrote a private note. The language is consistent with previous warnings from the road department. Mention of unnamed children in Girvan Forest. Uncommon. Marked under the symbol of an eye. Then, the drawer was locked as if never opened. In 1664, Dargold, retired and widowed, wrote a letter to a former colleague. Only a fragment survived 2 centuries later at a London flea market. On the folded paper, only a single sentence could be read in pencil. The boy without a finger is still on the school roll. The name is repeated every 7 years. Are you still here? We've gone deep into the dust of a history that most people have forgotten or willfully forgotten. The gate is still there. And what if that name reappears this year? What do you think is really being hidden? An obscure school believed to have been somewhere near the Ballantrae coast has disappeared from the historical record. Of the few documents that survive, many of the student lists show signs of alteration. Letters have been shaved. Thin names have been written over each other. Dates of attendance have been circled and crossed out without being replaced. No list repeats names in 7-year cycles as is rumored. But one record bears the same crude drawing in the margin, 5 short whip marks and an eye that never closes. No such symbol has ever been registered by a family, a church, or any royal office. The ink used is still unknown. The sea was late that day. It crept ashore at dusk, sluggish and heavy, dragging kelp and rope coiled like catgut across the rubble at North Cove near Turnberry. He was found face down, his body draped over a clump of seaweed, his hands spread out, his mouth full of sand. His boots were undone, one of them missing. His coat was intact, but the buttons were sewn on backwards as if by someone who had never seen the human form. The next day, his brother identified the body, Ian Calder, 34, a sailor whose last ship had docked at Port Glasgow weeks before. No visible wounds, just a thin scratch on his neck, dry, not deep. The sea had not taken his breath this time. He had not drowned. No salt water had been near, but it was what he had carried. That was truly chilling. In 2 folds of his waterproof coat were found small, clumsily sewn soiled canvas bags tied with hemp rope. There were 6 bags in all. Inside each bag were human teeth. 37 all children's molars had been replaced. When the surgeon examined them, he noticed something strange. The roots were intact, none of them broken. Some showed signs of calcification, which is rare in children under 12. And most unusual, the enamel had been polished. Not by time or food, but by contact. The teeth had been handled, touched, repeatedly. News spread quickly along the coast. Some thought it was evidence of body smuggling. Others thought it was some kind of sailor's charm used to prevent capsizing. But his brother Malcolm Calder told a more bizarre story. According to him, the teeth were part of his fortune. Malcolm said they had been found just a month ago when he and Ian were cleaning out the cabin of his late uncle Hamish Calder, a widower who had lived alone near Orange for more than 20 years. The solitary man had sold nets and lamp oil to fishermen. He had died 5 winters ago, childless and unclaimed. When the brothers entered the abandoned cabin, there was little that could be used. A rusty stove, 3 chairs with loose legs, and in the attic, nailed to the wooden floor, was a cedar box, no bigger than a sea log. The lid was sealed with a strange, odorless grey wax, not the usual beeswax or red wax. Inside were 6 cloth bags. Each had a note attached in ink. The ink was faded, but only one word was legible: sorcerer. The others were water-smeared or written in symbols that no one in the family understood. One looked like a knot, but it was not the kind of fishing net marking they had ever seen. When asked why he had brought the teeth, Malcolm shrugged. Ian would say, "They're his. Then keep them. For me." The Calders had no children. No dead babies, no adopted children. There were no toys in the house, no little clothes. Yet Ian Malcolm said had a strange attachment to the teeth. He would wrap them in cloth in a sea chest, open them each night, count them, wipe them clean, and put them away. After the second night, Malcolm said Ian wouldn't let him touch them again because he'd started dreaming of mouths that never closed. After Ian's death, the cloth bags were handed into the local parish office. They were roughly recorded as unclassified personal property and then forwarded to the police station in Ayr. But there was no mention of their arrival in the receipt book. Just a brief entry in Turnberry's diary, written in a different hand. Teeth received. No dentist in the area. Destruction instructions unclear. Ink on label indelible. Years later, the cedar box was found at an estate sale. There was nothing left inside, only a paper tag illegible, but with horizontal markings. A maritime historian was called in to examine it. He found that the markings were similar to the ballast board system used to weigh ships. But when he compared them with old sailing codes, he found no match. Instead, he found a match with a funeral register from a small church south of Ayr, dated 1602. In it was a curious note under the burial of an unnamed child. Mouth opened too late. Teeth recorded as removed. No parents to claim body. There was no signature. The grave had no marker. And on the edge of the last page, where the paper had rotted and was folded as crisp as ash, someone had quietly added a line almost invisible. The air must chew. This ink, unlike all the others, had not faded with the years. It had all started with a damp piece of sheepskin, the ink smeared as if it had deliberately hidden itself under the pressure of the registrar's hand. In a short week, 5 applications for marriage licenses had come in, all invoking an old provision used only in times of plague or war. All 5 had asked for the verification of the place of origin to be waived on the grounds of unknown sea origin. That phrase, unknown origin, was unfamiliar even to the village elders. Yet in all 5 letters the writing was identical, no spelling mistakes, no change in sentence structure. All referred to couples with coastal bloodlines. None had surnames. No parents. Just the names. Isla Kalansley, May Doran. At that time, the head of Columbinill's registrar's office was Gilbert Ririth, a man known for his prudence and perseverance. 3 bad harvests, a black pox epidemic, and never once had he made a mistake. His handwriting was thin and strict, even on wet sheepskin, as steady as a machine. He noted the oddities in the applications, but he still considered them. For the poor or homeless, missing papers were not uncommon. But there was one thing that made him uneasy. All 5 letters had the same smell. Not the salt smell that was common to seafarers, but the smell of iron, sharp and sour, like the rust of church bells. The ink, when heated over fire, turned green at the edges. And when he put his thumb to stamp, his skin was left with a slight burn. He noted the mark in the margin. 2 days later, the first couple appeared. They came by the eastern trail on foot, without carriage or horse. Their shoes were identical, brand new, unpatched. The man gave his name only as Doran. He said the bride was light-skinned, and given though no one knew what he meant, Doran asked for a marriage license, quickly saying they would not stay longer than 2 church bells. As was the procedure, Ririth asked for residency papers and witnesses. Doran silently produced a small piece of parchment bearing a church emblem. Ririth had never seen an anchor pierced through a crown of thorns with the inscription, "By the sound, not by the gate." No parish in the area had ever had such a mark. The parchment had no name of church. The bride stood by, silent. Her veil was not lace but thick linen obscuring her entire face, revealing only the outline of her cheekbones and chin. When asked to lift it to verify her identity, she said nothing but placed a folded piece of paper on the table. It bore only one line: "She has been seen, though not by you." Rereath refused to issue the paper. The two men did not react. They left as quietly as they had come. But the next morning, the register on his desk had been altered. The page he had deliberately left blank the day before now bore two names written in an ink he had never used. The handwriting was unlike anyone else's. The date was correct, and there was a strange signature, not his own, confirmed by blood. The following couples followed a pattern: no family, no sponsor. One man said he was of the rope bloodline born in the net. Another bride answered no questions, only hummed a 6-note tune of uncertain origin and always stopped at the sound of the bell. Rereath tried to block the file, writing a letter to the authorities for help. But the letter was returned sealed with a note: "Official document not routed." The postman swore that the postman had refused to accept it, not because of a lack of stamps, but because the letter had no origin mark. It came from itself. After the fifth couple, Rereath stopped recording. But the names kept appearing in the register. Every night, a new page appeared. The ink was still faded, the layout was the same. But now, there was a new column, confirmed by fold. That column had never appeared in any register before. Rereath turned the pages, and now the column was inserted everywhere: births, deaths, marriages. No further details. A week later, Mr. Rereath resigned. The resignation letter was not written by him but by his assistant. The assistant said that for days Rereath did not speak but drew circles on the table with salt. When asked why, the assistant said only, he said, "The bride's dresses had no backs, and the veils were sewn to the bones." The entire file that year was quietly sealed. No trace of the 5 couples could be found, no names in the family registers, no houses, no churches recorded. But in 1786, when the old registry office was being renovated, a small sealed drawer was opened. Inside were 5 identical rings woven from a cord dyed so red it looked black in the candlelight. Inside each ring, a line was engraved so small it was almost invisible. Every oath is bound to water. Every name is borrowed until returned. No one had ever filed those rings away. If you've come this far with us at Sleepy History Tales, how did you feel? Have any of you ever come across a recurring detail that no one else remembers? A name, a smell, a 6-note rhythm. Tell us. But if the story in the Coleman register makes you want to double-check your name in the middle of the night, you're not alone. The drawer was closed forever. Marriages were unrecorded, unproven, and forever disputed. But in some registers along the West Coast, there was a mysterious column marked, validated by fold. No parish acknowledged adding it. No one knew what a fold was. All that was known was that once the column was marked, the record could not be altered, not even by the state. Strange, right? And that was just the beginning. After a long rain, the canyon began to collapse. Not suddenly, but bit by bit, silently, insidiously, like a flower soaking up water, like a rock splitting over time. 3 days later, a sheepdog refused to follow its owner. Instead, it lingered around a torn patch of earth as if the place were calling to it. At the edge of a moose path, a deep, soft, mossy trench was found. And at the bottom were 2 bodies lying side by side, shoulder to shoulder, heel to heel. No sign of a struggle, no blood, no bruises, no torn clothes. Everything was too quiet. The doctor who had been summoned was Piers Charas, a wandering lecturer in anatomy. Not affiliated with any university, but carrying a certificate from the Royal Society of Edinburgh. When he arrived, his boots were still stained with Dumfries peat. In the walnut box were a set of precision measuring tools and a half-filled notebook with drawings of human muscles. But what he saw of Glenap left him speechless. Both bodies were men in their 30s, almost identical in proportion but asymmetrical. Both had unusually long right hands, almost an inch over the norm. The fingers were thick with 3 phalanges instead of 2. The nails grew into the skin as if they had been cut from below. The teeth were the strangest part, too thick for their age, race, or environment. Layer upon layer, like slate. Charas tried to take a sample from the right jaw, but his steel spike shattered immediately. The gums were not necrotic, nor did they bleed. Instead of being red, they were black as rock. And both had the same small cleft in the upper canine, suspiciously similar. That evening, he quietly drew the 2 bodies by the light of an oil lamp. The sketch is now lost, but a friend of his had seen the description. The drawing was detailed down to every vein, every space between the eyes, every curve of the sternum. The right shoulder blade seemed to be trying to stretch backward, not forward as normal. Charas sent his report to the College of Surgeons the following spring, titled "On the Symmetry of 2 Identical Deformed Individuals." But the files were never allowed to be displayed publicly. An archivist labeled them unfit for display without giving a reason. Within a week, the entire collection was pulled from the library. It was moved to a locked cabinet in the Rare Anomalies unit, with the key given to Dr. Elias Munro, who would later be discredited for falsifying data about trauma. Charas didn't object. Instead, he went to Colmonel the following year to look for Clue's twins who died at the same time, congenital malformations or unidentified bodies near Glenap. But nothing. No records matched. The cemetery caretaker said that only a single grave had been dug that year. Only an old man, a former midwife's assistant, mentioned a birth 30 years earlier. A woman on the coast had given birth to twin boys without calling a priest. They were born with excessively long wrists, he said, and no one had seen them since. Charas wrote down the story. He underlined excessively long wrists twice in his notebook, but he never sent it in. Years later, when the university renovated the floor of the archives, the locker was removed. It was empty. No papers, no folders, no copper plates. But under the floor they found an imprint, not burned, not carved, but a deep mark of time. The imprint was the shape of a human skeleton. The spine slightly curved, the right arm longer than the left. And where the individual's name should have been, there was only a scribbled line. Unprecedented structure. Origin unknown. Charas never taught again. He disappeared. No address, no message. Only a single page of his notebook remained torn at the edges with 3 hasty words different from his usual handwriting. They are studying. Who were they? What were they studying? And who taught them? No one knew. And what about Glenap Canyon? It was still sealed by that landslide. But if you looked from above, the shape of the canyon followed a curve like the human spine, leaning to the left. Always to the left. And on that first frosty day of the year, when the sun had not yet broken, the frost, the milk that came out of one of Ewan Kincaid's cows was not white, but warm cloudy and pale pink, like snow melting through copper pipes, the farmer. His name was Kincaid, a widower with neither sons nor help. Since the peat sickness took the last of his hands, first thought it was the feed. He scrubbed out the bucket with ash water, wiped the cow's teats clean as memory, and tried again. But the milk only deepened in color. By the second day it had thickened. Not curdled, just wrong. It hung in the pail with the consistency of syrup and carried a faint metallic scent. Stringy, like something resisting separation. The cow, though still alert, began turning slow circles in her morning tether, stamping one back hoof with growing agitation, like something beneath her skin was humming. On the third morning, Kincaid found the calf, stillborn, expelled sometime during the night without a sound. Its limbs were knotted inward, twisted as though it had turned too late and too hard within the womb. The straw beneath was wet, but strangely clean. No blood. The calf's mouth had never opened. Its tongue, when Kincaid gently parted the lips, was dark at the root. Black. He called for Agnes Michael. In those parts, Agnes was the herbalist, not just for wounds and burns, but for things less easily named. She came wrapped in wool and quiet, carrying only a bundle of bay leaves and an iron rod wrapped in boiled cloth. It wasn't medicine, it was memory. She approached the cow, slowly circling her once before kneeling. She didn't touch the beast, only dipped a rag into the milk and held it up to the light. The cloth stained red at the corners, but then cooled into a dull brown. She didn't taste it. She only sniffed and whispered a phrase not often used in veterinary circles. There's marrow in it. Not blood, not pus, but marrow. The seep of bone leached upward into the milk, finding a way out it should never have known. Kincaid swore he had changed nothing. The cow had eaten only grain and pit-stored roots, same as the rest. No mineral blocks, no river water, no molds. The others were fine, healthy even. Only this one, the youngest, had veered from routine. She had been in her second season of calving. Strong, mild-tempered, grain-fed and gentle even when prodded. There had been no warning signs. But by the 5th day, she simply stopped rising. No limp, no fever, no visible pain. She folded her legs neatly beneath her like she was kneeling for something sacred and stayed that way. Alert, breathing eyes, clear, but entirely still. The next morning, Kincaid found the hoof. It hadn't been torn, not severed, not gnawed. It was still attached, but it looked digested. The outer keratin had spiraled inward, chipped delicately, like a scroll being unwound. The flesh beneath showed signs of pressure, like something had ground it slowly from the outside, but there was no blood, no tear, no break in the skin, and no predator. The snow between the barn and the house was undisturbed. No tracks. Nothing but Conincade's own. Agnes returned. This time she didn't speak softly. She told him the animal had to be culled. Not for health, for quiet. She didn't stay to help. But she did take a piece of the hoof, sealing it in waxed linen and ash, the old way to preserve rot without inviting decay. 2 days later, she rode to Gawain to speak with the parish council. She wanted the hoof examined by a surgeon. She once knew a man who had documented a rare bone-softening condition in children. She mailed the sample to him. It never arrived. Weeks passed. But the waxed linen came back empty. No note, no label. Just a single thumb-sized stain in the corner of the cloth, blackened and spiraled, curling outward like something had imprinted its last gesture, there and then vanished. Conincade never replaced the cow. He scrubbed the stall and left it vacant. Some nights he claimed he could hear it hoof taps on the stone beneath. Not wood, stone. Always 5 beats. Then silence, then repeat. He boarded the barn shut. The other cows changed too. They began resisting the pail, letting down only a trickle of milk, looking away sharply, like something was always standing just behind the doorframe. Their breath grew short, their eyes too wide. Conincade wrote to the council. He requested exemption from the tithe, claiming the milk turned before the sun spoiled by something he couldn't name, but the cows already seemed to know. He never got a reply, but in the winter meeting, minutes of the registrar's book, someone had scribbled a note in the margin. It was unsigned. This stall does not ferment. This barn yields no mold. Months later, a land surveyor passed through. He was measuring drainage mapping future field lines. He sampled the soil beneath the cow's resting place. What he pulled out was not soil. 6 inches wide, 2 feet deep, and not a worm, not a root, not a single sign of organic life. Only a soft powder, chalk white, flaky, dry as bone dust. He marked the spot with an X, not to return but to avoid rerouting near it. That old map still sits in the Air District Records office. And yes, dear listener, the X is still visible, faded, but beneath it, written so faintly you'd miss it, without a lamp, the surveyor added a question. If it came from within, why did the bones refuse to form? No answer was ever filed. And now, a boy stands at a threshold. He does not knock. He doesn't need to. He stands barefoot beneath the lintel feet, crusted with frost arms, crossed over his chest, not to warm, but as if remembering what warmth once was. The hour is just past 7. Early enough that the dew still bites. Late enough that the bell will toll soon. But what bell? And who, if anyone, will answer? The door was open before he could knock. The woman standing inside was Elizabeth Cowie, a midwife renowned in 4 parishes, not so much for her skill, though she was very good, but for her absolute certainty. Elizabeth asked no questions, never lost her way even in the bitter winter. She carried her tools in a linen and oilskin bag secured with brass pins. She dressed, simply kept no records, never left a trace. She was summoned, she came, she delivered, and then she disappeared. She had dressed before she left the door that morning. Neighbors later reported that she had not lit. A fire had not drawn any water. Her white apron was unstained. The only thing she had left in that silent house was a candle, unlit, laid neatly on the table. The boy said nothing. When she approached, he turned and walked away, not looking back. By then the fog was rolling in, drifting close to the ground, obscuring the fences, turning the stone walls ash grey. No one knew where they were going, but her footprints blurred in the cold dust, tilted west toward the sea. She was not noticed until late in the afternoon. A pregnant woman came to find her for the naming ceremony of her second child. As the sun set, the villagers filed across the fields, calling her name without haste, as if hoping the silence would end. But night fell and the silence remained. The next morning they reached the shore. Near Cape Bennane, where the cliffs narrowed into a high, steep path, a shepherd found a strange object lying at the edge of the path, close to the mouth of a cave. It was Elizabeth's apron, not torn, not discarded. It was folded and knotted as she had always done. Folded once, looped twice. But this time, the white cloth was stained with blood, and Verix fresh, still damp. Despite the frost that had frozen the grass around it, there was no needle or thread inside the apron, only a copper pin bent in the middle, and a piece of twine twisted 7 times, trimmed at both ends. No one dared enter the Bennane cave. The villagers called it the cursed cave, narrow at the mouth, deep at the bottom, as if breathing borrowed air. They said the echoes inside were not loud, but rhythmic. The waves entering were quiet. The waves leaving roared. A priest was invited from Girvan to bless the cave. He refused to go near the cave, declaring it no structure for penance. His sermon was delivered from the road that backed onto the sea. There was no burial. There was no body. Only the apron, later cremated at the parish boundary, according to local custom. The copper pin was kept. It now lies in the town's archives, mislabeled pin bent origin unknown. A few weeks later, a wandering stonemason named Bram Lawton claimed to have seen a child walking barefoot along the cliffside path. The child did not shiver with cold, nor did he turn to look. When Bram offered him a piece of bread, the child stopped, took it with both hands and said, "Help has come." Lawton asked no more questions. The child disappeared into the mist without a trace. In 1679, 67 years later, a coastal survey party, for the purpose of defense, reopened part of the Bennane cave. In a damp crevice, deep under a fallen ledge, they found a tattered bundle of waxed cloth. Inside were several moldy pieces of cloth and a strip of brittle old leather, neatly folded in the hem of a garment. The ink had faded, but 3 lines were still legible. The child wore the wrong crown. The string was not handed down by word of mouth. Do not send it to anyone else. We have had enough. The document was not included in the official report. The surveyor who took it retired that year and was never contacted again to verify. The cave later collapsed naturally. The mouth of the cave is now only exposed at low tide, a few minutes of darkness. Then it sinks back into the sea. And to this day, every few winters on a foggy morning, the parish church bell rings once earlier than the hour. No one has seen the person pulling the string. The ink was gone. The headings had faded to spectral outlines, and the form's gridwork, designed to record life, now stood empty like a forgotten grave. But beneath that silence, if you tilted it just right under lamplight, there were indentations. Faint, pressed, deliberate. Someone had written here, someone had erased it. This discovery didn't come until 1614 during a routine audit of earlier census records. The man assigned was Bartholomew Crane, a clerk more known for recopying errors than correcting them. When he came across the blank page, he thought at first it was a printing defect. But something about the texture caught him off guard. It felt thinner, waxy even. Not the kind of decay time would leave behind, but something purposeful, something chemical. He brought it to the local council surveyor, and together they performed a charcoal rub on the surface, dusted it lightly with ivory powder. What emerged was ghost-like, but unmistakably real. There were 3 revelations. First, a list. 23 sets of initials, no full names, each followed by a date. All clustered within a single week in early March. No year. Just a repeating M3 that ghosted the margin like a whispered code. Some names had 2 dates. Why? Second beside these initials were records of rations, meat, oats, broth. But the portions were abysmally low. Half ladle, quarter loaf, 6 bones. Barely enough for survival. Barely enough to keep someone alive, or perhaps that wasn't the goal. And third, between every 5th entry, a symbol. A strange one. A hooked line with 2 vertical dashes through it. It was neither number nor letter. Just a mark. Crane reported the findings to his superior. He was told to refile it. Quietly, no discussion. But Crane didn't listen, not entirely. Before returning the altered census to the shelf, he traced the indentations onto vellum. He then folded it, hid it in the spine of a ledger on absentee landholders, and told no one. That tracing remained undisturbed for over 50 years, until 1669. That year, a junior archivist named Margaret Bell was conducting a review of missing tax ledgers from the early Stuart reign. She found the tracing by accident. It was brittle, cracked at the folds, but she tried to line it up against known parish records. Nothing matched. But Margaret saw something else. The initials marked with the strange hooked symbol, every 5th one resurfaced later in death rolls between 6004 and 6006. All listed as unknowns, all buried outside official cemetery boundaries, all marked the same way, delivered unto record, not unto stone. She compiled her findings into a file. Inside Crane's tracing the meal rations, the burials, the symbol. She titled it simply 17th Redaction. No further notes, no conclusion. Just a folder later sealed and labeled Statistical Irregularity, not for distribution. But in 1792, the file was disturbed once more. An Edinburgh University researcher looking into early Stuart-era nutrition trends stumbled across the folder misfiled under tithe disputes. He found the original census page still blank, still bound between pages 16 and 18. But now, the margins had stiffened as if heat had touched the paper. And when he fully turned the page, something new appeared. A 4th mark in the lower right corner, a circle split in half with a single diagonal line. Beside it, etched softly into the parchment, too shallow for ink, but deep enough to feel one word: Fed. After that, the census page vanished again. In 1801, it was removed from all public record inventories. And today, if you look through the National Census Index, no page is listed as missing. But curiously, The enumeration for the year 6003 jumps between pages 16 and 18, and the count. An unexplained increase of 23 bodies, no names, just meal portions, and buried in a secondary ledger titled Census Anomalies. An unnamed archivist had scribbled in pencil, "Ink can be lifted. Absence cannot. No date, just a smudged initial M." Meanwhile, time cracked the land. Not hammer, not man, but frost. A widening of earth as though something ancient was exhaling. Workers were excavating along the Bennane slope, a Crown-funded project to improve the coastal road from Gervin to Ballantrae. It was a modest plan. A cart path, some drainage work. What they uncovered was no drainage line. A sealed vault emerged from the limestone shelf. Not a burial pit, no. The shape was too symmetrical, too intentional. A stone arch fitted precisely sealed with riveted iron along the rim. The rust had bloomed red over time, but the barrier still held. There was a vent, thin, no wider than a thumbnail. No breath came out. Just silence. The first man who peered inside didn't speak. He simply stepped away and fetched his foreman. The second, older, stared longer. When asked what he saw, he answered softly, "It isn't shaped for breath." And when they finally broke through the seal, the sound that met them wasn't stone giving way. It was something softer, slipping, settling, like grain spilling from a torn sack. Here at Sleepy History Tales, we don't pretend to have every answer. We just follow the trails others have tried to erase. And as we've seen, even blank pages can whisper. Even absence has a weight. Let us know what you think was erased, and why only every fifth name was marked. Was it food ritual punishment or something else entirely? Because if this was a ledger of the living, then who or what was doing the feeding? Stay curious, stay gentle. And as always, sleep well. The Ridge Cohort. Buried. Truths beneath the limestone mouth. When they opened the vault, they expected soil. Or perhaps some remnant of older infrastructure. A pipe, a pit, maybe a forgotten burial. What they found was not burial. It was something else. There was no floor in the chamber. Only a shallow depression filled halfway with bone. Hundreds of them. The foreman halted work at once. The site was marked. A church curate was summoned. He arrived, reluctantly brought no scripture, and stood in silence for several minutes before speaking. His only words. These were not laid. They were placed. The bones were small. Many were juvenile. Femurs no longer than a milk ladle. Jaws with unformed molars. A humerus that weighed no more than a spoon's handle. But what disturbed them most wasn't the size, it was the precision. Nearly every bone had been broken, deliberately snapped cleanly at near identical points. The fragments were aligned with eerie symmetry. There was no carving, no string or leather, no burial rite, just order, intent. Then they found the clasp. It was brass oval, flattened slightly at the hinge. On its face, the royal insignia of James VI, a crowned lion above two crossed scepters. The kind of clasp used to fasten satchels or folios. This one had been damaged, crushed at the edge, perhaps caught between stones. It was turned over to the magistrate. From there to the Rhodes Commission. No comment was made. In the project ledger, someone initials EH simply wrote object, royal mark. No document attached, no follow-up, no chain of custody. The vault was not examined further. No count of bones was taken. Instead, orders arrived, not from the local magistrate, but from Edinburgh, delivered verbally by an unnamed rider. The vault was to be filled with rubble. The road rerouted 20 yards inland. One worker, a young man from Stranraer named Michael G., disobeyed quietly. Before the vault was closed, he retrieved a single jawbone and placed it in his toolkit. Within a week, he stopped reporting to work. Neighbors said he became strange. He murmured measurements in his sleep, 5th down, 4th wide. He refused food. He stared into corners. Then one morning he was found upright in his loft, his mouth packed with wool, a pink tinge in the water pail beside him. The jawbone was gone, but next to him a note written in an unsteady hand. They were not lost. They were accounted for. The road was built, the vault paved over. No memorial, no mention. But something beneath the surface didn't rest easy. Within a year, the paving stone nearest the vault's center sank twice. No fault found. Just sinking. In 1680, another clasp was discovered, this time beneath Edinburgh's Hall of Records. Identical to the first. Affixed to a census folio from the year 6003. Specifically the copy sent to the outermost parish. It was fastened to page 17. But that page was missing, cleanly cut, not torn, just gone. A residue of iron remained in the crease, suggesting the clasp had been shut while the page was still warm. When archivists tried to match this clasp to the 1615 discovery, they found the first one had vanished. No sign-in, no paper trail, just one penciled note in the project ledger vault resolved. Do not enumerate. Still, someone had noticed. In a nearby parish, Kilpatrick, a baptismal book was found, faded and incomplete. But one entry stood out. Children of the Stone Mouth. Seen once. Never sung for. No names, but a number. D3, underlined twice. No seal. No origin. Just one chilling phrase scratched across the top. This was not a clan. That document now rests in a sealed folio in the Crown Office archives. It was discovered, oddly enough, folded among routine correspondence letters about tax allocation grain, spoilage border tolls. But it didn't belong. Its handwriting, though official, was cold, restrained. Most of the first paragraph had been chemically lifted, but indentations remain. Bennane, Carrick Hills, Red Ridge Survey, post-dawn observation. No official record exists of such a survey. But the second paragraph, it tells a story. Subjects presented in small collective structures. No hearth, no walls, but signs of long habitation. They weren't living. They were nesting. They did not speak, not in words. They repeated movements. Responses weren't verbal. They were gestural. The report shifted from observation to something almost anatomical. Limbs adapted for proximity. Crawling. Wrists overdeveloped. Palms thickened at center, worn at knuckle. Teeth broad. Flattened not by decay but pressure. And perhaps most disturbingly, nowhere does it say family or tribe or descendants. Instead, it refers to them again and again as Non-familial proximity cohorts. Not kin, not blood. Just something that lived together. In the margin beside paragraph 4, scrolled in graphite, a quiet but harrowing note. No one asked to be named. Not once. The report was unsigned, but its structure resembled security assessments, those intended not for royal review, but for quiet containment. Its final paragraph remains fully intact, and it reads, "They did not bury their dead. They did not name their children. They only consumed. And in consuming, they did not change." The word consumed is never explained. No mention of food, no mention of resource. But it doesn't have to be. In a private index, almost a century later, Crown Archivist Andrew Pell left a chilling reflection. The distinction was not in their crimes, but in their context. The horror lay not in what they did, but in the fact they did not hide it. That note was removed from the official register, but fragments of it survive in annotations, in margins, in whispers. One such note, scribbled in a 1638 church ledger: "Ensure no child from the Ridge cohort receives naming prior to baptism. Delay catechism. Allow for full observation." And in the 1615 edition of the Magistratus Manualis, there's a strange passage under the section "Improper kin structures." Cohabiting persons not declared by union or scripture, whose roles shift rather than age. Their rotation is not seasonal, but ritual. Here at Sleepy History Tales, we don't bring you monsters. We bring you what people once feared before they had a word for monster, and perhaps still do. What do you think the Ridge cohort was? Leftovers from a vanished culture? Survivors of something older? Or simply a reflection of us stripped of stories and names? Leave your thoughts. And as always, sleep well. That last paragraph. "This was not a clan" was omitted from subsequent editions. No official proclamation was issued. No parliament referred to the memorandum. No court heard an explanation. But a strange, eerie silence followed. All road building around Bennane Head ceased. From 1615 to 1702, no map recorded a new settlement within 3 miles of it. No census was completed. No fires were lit. No church bells rung. The silence lasted. Only once, in a failed delivery note between Mayabol and Girvan in 1624, did a merchant make a simple note of 3 lines. "Ridge Pass closed. No stopping at the hollow. No need." The handwriting seemed normal. But what was unusual was the way it was written, the same strong square handwriting as the original. This was not a clan memo. In the lower corner of the receipt, faintly hidden by the ink, there was a slight pressure mark. Not a signature, not a badge. Just 3 small strokes converging into a point, like an imprint pressed before the paper was completely dry. No ink, no name, just pressure. The librarians who had kept the memo that year had left no further comment. But someone named unknown had added a final line to the archives, now water-smeared but still partially legible. They are not ancestors. They are not lost. They were never born to exist in the records. The notebook was sealed. The bones were covered with paving stones. The names were never mentioned again. But the traces remained. Not in the official text, but hidden in the margins, in the unreasonable rationing, in the scribbles in the unchecked corner. They were not a clan. They had no graves. but they were counted silently, precisely, repeatedly. If you're still listening, you probably feel the same way we do. There are stories that only come to light when enough eyes are looking at the same faded page. Subscribe to Sleepy History Tales and tick 7th mark so you don't miss any records that people once wanted buried. And if you can leave a comment below, tell me what country you're watching from and when. We're not alone. Though separated by oceans, languages, and centuries, we're reading what was once erased together.